be very helpful if the Minister could. Thank you.
I call the Honourable Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased that there is support from national members for parts of the bill, saying that it is a good bill, apart from the fish and game issues. It was, of course, the government which made sure that the bill had its first reading. And I think there are some misconceptions in some of the calls from opposition members. First of all, Ms Dowie, with her supplementary order paper and the desire to have consistency. Well, of course, it is the bill with the additional provisions inserted by the majority of the Select Committee which will ensure consistency, because it means there is a consistent regime across the whole of New Zealand in relation to the management of sports fish. Because, of course, in the Lake Taupo area, sports fish, the trout fishery, is administered by the Department of Conservation because of an agreement with Te Wharetoa. Elsewhere in New Zealand, sports fish and game bird hunting are administered by Fish and Game because that is their statutory responsibility. So this bill will actually ensure a consistent regime across New Zealand in terms of infringement offences in the sports fish and game bird area. A misconception by Mr Simpson in relation to marine reserves. Fish and Game has powers in relation to game bird hunting and trout and salmon. It has no powers in relation to the management of marine reserves, so it won't be called upon to issue infringement notices in relation to any offences under the Marine Reserves Act. The other issues that Mr Simpson raised in terms of training and support for rangers who may not speak English, that already happens if the department comes across people who are offending against legislation. There is increasing diversity amongst Department of Conservation staff and rangers, but I would also make the really important point that these infringement notices won't be issued in the field. The information will be passed to a specialised team within the Department of Conservation, probably of about 3 people. They will make the decision about whether an infringement notice is issued, whether proceedings are commenced in terms of a prosecution, or whether there is a recommendation that there be just a warning given. So it's that specialised team that has the expertise there. Then going to the report, the questions that Dr Russell raised in relation to Fish and Game, there are a number of safeguards in the Act around the provisions that are provided in Clause 4A, which inserts the provisions around the National Fish and Game Compliance and Law Enforcement Policy. And as Dr Russell noted, there will be no Fish and Game rangers or honorary rangers who get this power to issue infringement notices unless a national compliance and enforcement policy has been developed by Fish and Game and approved by the Minister of Conservation. There's a requirement that Fish and Game report annually to the Minister of Conservation, so there's that safeguard that there will be annual reporting on how those infringement notice powers are exercised. There are also quite detailed provisions in new Clause 70V of the bill, which only allow the Director of the New Zealand Fish and Game Council to authorise Fish and Game rangers in writing to issue infringement notices under the Act, and the Director of Fish and Game cannot delegate that power. So there are a lot of safeguards in the bill in relation to Fish and Game. And as Dr Duncan Webb noted in the second reading, there are a number of organisations like the Plumber and Gas Fitters Board which can issue fines to people. So if the National Party is saying that it supports the work of Fish and Game, then it should take that next step and support the power of Fish and Game to stand up and issue infringement notices to those who offend against the provisions in the Conservation Act. So it already has the councils already have quite significant enforcement powers under both the Conservation Act and the Wildlife Act, and it seems that the National Party is expressing no confidence in Fish and Game by its criticisms of the ability of the 12 regional Fish and Game councils to have this power to issue infringement notices.
I call Sarah Dowie.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair.